Welcome, everybody, to the 2020 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, or as we like to call it, the VGBF. I am Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host, and we're so happy to have you with us this evening. Although we wish you could have been here in person, we're super excited to have you with us virtually. And to that point, more and more things are actually going to open up these days, so excitement's in the air. Before we start, please do three things for us. First, like this video. Second, comment below to let us know where you're watching us from. And third, hit the subscribe bell so that we can send you notifications about all of our upcoming presentations. Undoubtedly, you will have questions during this presentation. Please write them in the chat section. Most, if not all of them, will be sent to the authors and will be answered at the end of this presentation. And of course, we encourage you to support tonight's featured authors by purchasing their books through independent bookseller and festival partner, Politics and Prose. Finally, a big thank you goes out to VGBF's featured sponsors, the David and Mikel Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown RPAI, and Montgomery College. Okay, let's get to it. Tonight, two best-selling authors discuss their latest historical novels. The Last Train to London by Meg Waite Clayton takes us to Nazi-occupied Europe, where one brave woman helps children escape the Kindertransports. Meg is the international best-selling author of The Last Train to London, The Race for Paris, Beautiful Exiles, and The Wednesday Sisters. A graduate from the University of Michigan and its law school, she's written for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Forbes, Runner's World, and she's been for public radio. The Paris Hours by Alex George brings alive the dazzling creativity of Paris between the wars, and four ordinary people whose stories, told together, are as extraordinary as the glorious city they inhabit. Alex is a native of England and has worked for 8 years as a corporate lawyer in London and Paris. He has lived in the Midwest of the United States for the last 16 years and is the founder and director of the Unbound Book Festival. He is also the owner of Skylark Bookshop, an independent bookstore in downtown Columbia, Missouri. Moderating tonight's discussion is Carrie Callaghan. Carrie is the author of the historical novels A Light of Her Own and Salt the Snow. Her short stories have been published in multiple literary journals, and she is a senior editor with the Washington Independent Review of Books. Meg, Alex, Carrie, welcome to the presentation.
Thank you for having us. It is such a pleasure to be here in the virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I am a huge fan of the regular Gaithersburg Book Festival, and so I'm sad that we're not sitting under a tent where either it's pouring rain or it's hot out, and being able to interact in person. But there is something really nice and special about being invited into one another's homes. So thank you all for inviting us into your homes. In particular, thanks to Meg and Alex for inviting us into their homes, which are quite far from Maryland at the moment. So let's go ahead and kick this off with short readings from each of these beautiful books. I'm really enthusiastic about sharing these books with you all. And then I'm going to ask some questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for some questions. So Meg, would you mind starting first?
Oh, sure. I'll be reading from The Last Train to London. I will tell you, I don't love reading, so bear with me here. It's a short passage. Truce, who is the woman who led the rescues of children from pre-World War II, Nazi-occupied Europe, is basically on a train. This is in the first chapter. She's on a train with some Jewish children trying to get them across the border. And she's at where the train stops. She tidied the children's hair and clothes, addressing each again by name, but working quickly, keeping an eye on the dwindling line of passengers. All right now, she said, wiping the drool from the baby's mouth as the passengers disembarked. Go wash your hands, just as we practiced. Already, the Nazi border guard was mounting the stairs. Go on, go quickly, but take your time washing up, Truce said calmly. To the girl, she said, keep your brothers in the lavatory, sweetheart. The girl said, until you put your gloves back on. It was necessary that Truce not seem to be hiding the children, yet nor did she want them too close for this negotiation. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, she thought, unconsciously putting the ruby to her lips like a kiss. She opened her pocketbook, a more delicate thing than she would have carried had she known she'd be returning to Amsterdam with 3 children in tow. She fumbled inside it, removing her rings as the children, now behind her, traipsed away down the aisle. Ahead, the border guard appeared. He was a young man, but not so young that he might not be married, might not have children of his own. Visas, you have visas to leave Germany, he demanded of Truus, the sole adult now remaining in the carriage. Truus continued rooting in her bag as if to extract the required papers. Children can be such a handful, can't they? She replied warmly as she fingered the single Dutch passport still in the handbag. You have children, officer. The guard offered an unsanctioned hint of a smile. My wife, she is expecting our first child, perhaps on Christmas Day. How fortunate for you, Truus said, smiling at her own good fortune, as the guard glanced toward the sounds of water running in the sink, the children chattering as sweetly as bramble finches. She let the thought sit with him. He would soon have a baby, not unlike little Alexei, who would grow into a child like Israel or dear, dear Sarah. Truus fingered the ruby, sparkling and warm, on the lone ring she now wore. You have something special for your wife to mark the occasion, I'm sure. Something special, the Nazi repeated, returning his attention to her. Something beautiful to wear every day, to remember a most special moment. She removed her ring, saying, My father gave this to my mother the day I was born. Her pale, steady fingers offered the ruby ring, along with her single passport. He eyed the ring skeptically, then took the passport alone, examined it, and glanced again to the back of the carriage. These are your children. Dutch children could be included on their parents' passports, but hers listed none. She turned the ruby to catch the light, saying, They're more precious than anything, children.
Beautiful, thank you. Alex?
So the Paris Hours tells the story of 4 different people, and it's always a question about when I do a reading, which of the 4 do I choose? And today, rather by random, I'm choosing one of them. His name is Jean-Paul Maillard, and we meet him for the first time, and he's just waking up. Jean-Paul Maillard closes his eyes and dreams of America. The needle touches the spinning vinyl with the gentlest sigh of static. He listens, spellbound. That clarinet, the first low trill fat with promise, then the solo ascent to the heavens, soaring smoothly through the registers. By the time that ecstatic high note, limpid and beautiful, pours into his ears, Jean-Paul has made his escape. He sweeps through the open window onto Rue Barbette and hurtles down the cobbled streets of the Marais, streaking westward across the city. In a moment, he is flying over the dark waters of the Atlantic. The music beckons him on. He soars high over the city's skyscrapered silhouette, his for the taking. He hears the rumble of the Harlem-bound A train in the orchestra's propulsive rhythms, low and sweet. He hears new worlds and the piano's blistering, arpeggiated attacks. Images streak past like the onrushing traffic hurtling down the arrow-straight avenues. Perfect lines of shimmying, high-kicking chorus girls, their cherry-red lips glistening in the spotlights. A liveried doorman striding onto the busy street, his hand outstretched for a yellow cab. Elegant matrons pushing through the door at Bergdorf's. Sharp-dressed men with two-tone shoes, hats pulled down low, huddled close on a street corner. When Jean-Paul Maillard dreams of America, he dreams of New York City. But those dazzling syncopations do not last forever. The music ends and the spell is broken. Reluctantly, Jean-Paul opens his eyes. America has retreated as it always does, and his shabby French apartment remains. He looks around. The place used to be so bright and tidy, so clean, and now every surface is coated with a patina of ancient dust. The wallpaper is staging a slow escape from the walls. A dark brown stain has annexed a corner of the ceiling. The gramophone is still going round. The silence is gently punctuated by the soft rhythmic bump of the needle against the spinning vinyl, as regular as a tiny heartbeat. He does not get up to switch it off. He likes the sound. Jean-Paul looks at the dim morning light creeping across the apartment window. It's been years since he has slept through the night. In the early hours of every morning, his ruined leg drags him from sleep. And then he sits in his armchair, listens to George Gershwin, and thinks about the lights of Manhattan.
Wonderful, thank you. So Alex, as you indicated, and this is also the case for Meg, both of your novels are sort of ensemble pieces. You've got multiple perspectives that are coming together at the end, or perhaps earlier, that they intersect in really beautiful and moving ways. Why did the books take this form? And I'll start with Alex.
So that's a great question. And I mean, there's a long story which I won't bore you with about what the sort of story that I thought I was going to write, which was an entirely different one about a lot of the more famous people who were living in Paris in 1927, which is when the book is set. And I was looking at telling a story with all sorts of extraordinary artists and musicians who were working there. And I began to worry that I wouldn't be able to do them justice. And then I also wasn't quite sure whether they really needed their story to be told. And so I redrew the focus away from that original thought that I had had and decided to tell stories of other, for want of a better word, more ordinary people and quieter stories. And so I just decided I just picked some and I came up with 4. Originally it was going to be 5. But that got too complicated. And so I just chose these 4 people who I sort of, selected more or less at random, or they popped into my head. And I made the decision at some point along the way that the whole story would take place over the course of one day, and that each of these characters would be presented in strictly alternating chapters. So we moved through the day and the chronology sort of preserved over the course of the day. And it was a challenge, and the sort of convention of a book like that is, of course, that that when you start with 4 different people, that at some point they're going to come together, and part of I hope the fun of the book is sort of trying to work out how that might be, and there are little clues, and they do sort of cross-pollinate at other points during the day, and various people, there are hints of the other existences, and then at the end they all come together. It wasn't I didn't sort of sit down thinking, this is what I'm going to do. Always with the way that I write, it tends to be, the nice way of putting it is organic. The more honest way of putting it is chaotic. And I'm never quite sure what's going on until it's down on the page, and then I try and sort it out. So it was a challenge to do it, and keeping 4 stories going all at the same time was hard, particularly because of the structure and having it over the course of one day. There were lots and lots of flashbacks as well, and it was a challenge to make sure that the reader was able to sort of follow everything. But it was fun. It was different to the sorts of books that I've written in the past, and I enjoyed the experiment of it. But I think probably next time I'm going to go back and do something a bit.
Something more straightforward.
Yeah.
It is fun reading how the characters intersect. You do feel like a detective. What about you, Meg?
I'm going to pick up on what Alex said, which is, that the characters are going to intersect. And I think that is, this book never came to me any other way than as a number of stories that would be alternating back and forth. And so I haven't really thought about, why I did it that way. It's just, something you do. It is different. I will tell you that everything else I've written has been first person. This is actually the first time I've even written from a third person point of view. So it's, I've written alternating first persons before, but not alternating third. But I think I was drawn to this story for 2 reasons. The story first came to me as the story of these children, these families who turn their children over to a stranger to take them to safety right before World War II began. So you start with a family, a mother, a father, a grandparent, whoever, going through that emotional decision to send their child away from them. And so I wanted to show that point of view. The children, obviously, they are going through a big moment, and that is really where the story started for me. I was totally fascinated. It started with a child who was by then in her 80s, who my son interviewed, and had gone through this. And so I wanted to show that point of view. I never imagined actually writing the story until I found kind of one of the other big points of view, which is Truus Weissemuller. She is a real Dutch woman. She actually rescued these children. She actually faced down Adolf Eichmann to bring thousands of children out of Nazi-occupied Europe. And so I knew I had to have her point of view. And there was no way to start the story with them all together and do a single point of view, because I wanted to show what life was like in Vienna before this all happened. So you would see the change in the people's lives. And I wanted to show what Truus's life was like before this moment in time. And I wanted to show the charge to get there together. And then one of the weird points of view that came in, I will tell you, is Adolf Eichmann, because he is the person that that Truus faces down. And I became very interested in showing his point of view, in large part to show that he wasn't born Adolf Eichmann. He was born somebody who was loved by his mother, who married a wife he loved, and who had children he loved. Because I think that we all can imagine ourselves being a heroic Truus and doing something extraordinary if the times require it. And I think very few of us imagine us being Adolf Eichmann or even a Nazi. And yet, obviously, that happened. So that's how it came to me. Like Alex, it was a challenge, but unlike Alex, I am actually well into the next book, and it has, again, rotating points of view. Shoot me.
So you're hooked. So, somebody said that all stories are love stories, but I think you could probably also argue in some way that all stories are war stories. And both of your novels are in some ways war stories, even though neither actually takes place during the war. For in Meg's case, it's just before, and in Alex's case, it's sometime after. So can you talk a little bit about how the war goes through your novels and how the characters feel that? And Meg, why don't you start?
So The Last Train to London starts just before World War II begins, and I suppose in some ways you could, Austria might say that they do say they were the first victims of the war, so they would tell you that the war had already begun. In fact, Hitler walked in and everybody cheered them, so it's a little hard for me to see that point of view. But it really is a story that's driven by the looming threat of war, because these children had to be gotten out. Everybody knew that war was coming. And everybody knew that once war was here, it would be increasingly difficult to get people to safety. And so that is the driver of the war. And it's this shadow that looms over the whole thing. And then the story does go on to the beginning of the war. So it does play out to that.
Yeah, it was interesting because when I wrote this book, I didn't know that was what I was doing. And sometimes you only discover after the event, when it's other people's perspectives. And several people, when they read early versions of the book, were saying, well, and all of this war, and I hadn't really realized that what I was doing, but of course that's right. And it makes sense. I mean, so the book is set, as I said, in 1927. So it's nearly 10 years since the Great War had finished, but its legacy was everywhere. And unfortunately, that is the way of wars. These things, they never go away. The effects linger for a very long time. Although, as I say, I hadn't realized I was doing it, but there were, and it's everywhere. And one of the, in a more beneficial way, one of the ways it's there is that, one of the interesting things about Paris in the 20s was this extraordinary explosion of creative talent and creativity that happened at that time. And I think that was largely a function of the absolute devastation that was caused by the war. And France and Paris in particular was sort of just obliterated by what had happened in the war and had to rebuild itself to the point where it was a fresh start. And so that was, I think, one of the reasons why there was this extraordinary explosion of talent. I think that thinking about war, and in addition to the First World War, there's also one of the characters is a refugee from the Armenian genocide. So that's a different sort of narrative to World War I. But he flees from that. other people are fleeing from their memories of what happened in World War One, and some of them can't escape them because they have wounds that manifest themselves. And I mentioned in the reading, you know, when he talks about his leg hurting, and that's because of something that happened during the war. So I think it's one of those themes that is so, unfortunately, so pervasive that, you know, you can write about it even without realizing it.
I do think, you know, I mean, the history of the 20th century is a history of war after war after war. So it's very difficult to write a story set in modern times without addressing war. So.
Yeah, I think probably set in almost any time without addressing war, unfortunately. But for us artists, at least, you know, that means that there's a lot of creative fields to mine. So Meg, you had mentioned a little bit of a cameo. I'm not sure that's the right word for the Eichmann character, but you both have famous personalities who appear in your book, that those serve as sort of a wonderful anchor for the reader who, you know, might know something about some of those characters. Could you both talk a little bit more about who stepped onto your fictional stage and why you decided to include those famous people? And we'll start with Alex.
Yeah, so my book, as I said, originally the book was supposed to be centered upon very well-known artists and musicians. And when I made the decision to make that switch and to redraw that focus, that was fine. But I also still wanted to have some of those extraordinary people in the book, but they now very much are on the periphery of the book rather than at the heart. And it was fun to put them in there. And one of the reasons, as you said, Carrie, was that doing that, it serves as a marker for the reader, and it allows people to identify and go, oh yes, okay, I have a sense of who this is, and if I see Ernest Hemingway, who's one of the people who's there, so that tells me something, and that helps. So I had a lot of fun with it, and so we have Ernest Hemingway, Sidney Bechet, Josephine Baker, Gertrude Stein, Marcel Proust, and it was yeah, I had a blast with it, and it's and Meg and I have talked about this in the past. There is and I'm fascinated to always hear her view on it. There's a balance that always needs to be struck between when you're using real people, between the established record and the story that you want to tell. And always at some point there's a conflict between the two, and it's an ongoing debate among people who write historical fiction about how you resolve that conflict. And there's a spectrum, and everyone has a different idea about exactly where you need to be on it. You know, for example, well, and I always say that, you know, the trick is to find the gaps and the places where there are holes that we don't actually know what happened, and then that gives you the license to sort of jump in and make something up. So, for example, by 1927, so I have Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway have a squabble in a bookshop, and did that happen? No, of course it didn't happen. I made it up, but it could have happened because by 1927, Stein and Hemingway were pretty much loggerheads. They were several years earlier had been inseparable, and by that time, so I think that the egos had got too much, and so they really couldn't stand each other. And so there was a lot of sort of snipping going on, and so that made sense to me that I could sort of make up that story and have these two real life characters have an entirely made up conversation. So that's, for me, that was just fine. But, you know, by the same token, you couldn't have had other people. You know, if somebody wasn't there, then that would have been a real problem. And so it's always a question of, you know, you need to do your research, and then you need to tell the story that you want to tell.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. I will say that I come to historical fiction as my background is in history. I studied history in school and not literature. So I'm probably fall on the purist end of the spectrum in terms of, you know, what you do and what you don't do. That having been said, you know, there are a number of real characters in my book. One of them is Adolf Eichmann. Obviously, he's not the most appealing of characters, but for him, I felt it was very important to deliver the real story of how he came to be Adolf Eichmann, because that's something that I would not feel comfortable playing with as a novelist. I would not like to suggest that a person becomes something like that in some way other than he has. So for the most part, Eichmann's scenes are based on the real history. There are some scenes that are made up, obviously, that I don't have a record for. For example, I know he has a dog, and I imagine him walking through some neighborhoods that I don't know that he actually ever, did that thing. But I know, for example, that the real confrontation he had with Truus Weissmuller was very much based on her record of that encounter. And I felt a responsibility to show, for this reason I said before, to show him truly as he is. The other real people in my novel are substantially less famous. The novel I did before this was Hemingway and Gellhorn, two very, well-known characters. And so that was a whole different kettle of fish. This one, there are a number of kind of smaller characters like Helen and Norman Bentwich, who were real people in England who helped organize the effort and get the effort of the Kindertransport effort approved through Parliament. But the most interesting one to me in terms of real characters was Truus Weissmuller. And I will tell you that she is a real Dutch hero. She is just an extraordinary person. And she is so completely forgotten that when my novel was sent by my American publisher out for foreign rights, the Dutch publisher I ended up with, which is HarperCollins, the Netherlands, nobody in the entire office had ever heard of Truus until they read this American novel, basically. And so she is somebody who, on the one hand, it was very, very hard to find out information about her. It involved, many things, including me trying to get my son to violate copyright laws and and learning about Dutch copyright laws so I could get a copy of a book. And me, non-speaking, I don't speak a word of Dutch. Google Translate and I translated an entire book in Dutch. It's not a very good translation, but it gets the facts out. So finding out about her was a real struggle just to find the information. But I want her to be well known. I want her to come alive as a person. I want readers to love her as much as I love her. So there are places where I fill in the gaps. For example, we know that Truus was childless at the time that she did this. She was in her early 40s and she had no children. And yet she risked her own life to save other people's children again and again. Do we know why she was childless? And this was the 1930s, when women did not even talk about the fact that they were childless, much less why that might be. If they had miscarriages, mostly you didn't know about it. And so those were gaps that I had to fill in. I had to guess what might have happened. I used some dramatic license to, and so for me, I feel like as long as I'm doing that in a way that is something that is not contradicting something that is known, and that is honest to the person who I am writing about, I want to deliver Truus in a way that is true to her. That's what I'm trying to do. And so I just fill in the gaps to do that. It was, writing about somebody like Truus, it was just extraordinary to imagine being something like that. And that's what you do when you're writing a character. You imagine that you are living, what they did. And it was truly inspiring. I think she's one of the most inspiring people I've ever read about. And I'm just feel honored that my little novel is helping her get better known around the world, even in her own native, the Netherlands.
Yeah, absolutely. She's an amazing woman. There is a new documentary that's just come out about her. Have you seen that?
It is out in Dutch, but not in English, right?
Oh, I saw it.
In English?
Yeah. Oh,
no, I have not seen it. Is it the one that Pamela did?
Oh, I don't know. Well, we can talk later about that.
Yeah, we will. Absolutely. Because I knew it was coming out in Dutch, but yes, many of the interviews are in English. Yes, I have seen it then. Many of the interviews are in English because she went around and collected children that Truus rescued and interviewed them very late in life. And many of them grew up in England or the United States and only speak English now. So the interviews are in English. Yeah, it was beautiful. Right. Very cool.
Yeah, I'm so glad to see Truus getting more attention. But also there's a beauty to your art too. In addition to just resurrecting a historical fixture, you are creating a work of art, both of you, that has merit, obviously, of its own beyond the history. In both of your books, there are moments when characters have good intentions, but then bad unintended consequences. And I'm thinking, for example, in Meg's book, of what happens to poor Adele Weiss, and then of Suren in Alex's book in The Paris Hours, or maybe like everything Guillaume does. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, I'm sorry. So tell me a little bit more about why you included those moments, and maybe you can tell our listeners which moments I'm referring to. And we'll start with Meg.
Oh yeah, well, without giving too many spoiler alerts, I think it is, what Carrie is referring to is there's a point in my book where Truce rescues a child, and it does not end well. Tears end up being shed, let's just say. And there were a number of reasons that point of the story is there. It's in part to illuminate Truce and what she is giving up and what she wants and what she can have and what she can't have. But I think it is very true in especially when people are trying to do good things, that things go wrong. And if you strive for perfection and you never let anything go wrong, then it's impossible to do things. And so I think one of the things that's inspiring about Truce is that she just kept doing things. She just kept going, and she did her best every time. And she recognized that not everything would go perfectly. Honestly, many of the Kindertransport children, when they got to England, some of them were maids. Some of them had pretty dreadful lives when they got to England. Some of them, many of them never saw their parents again. Some of them, when they saw their parents again, they spoke English only to parents who only spoke German. Many, many difficult stories about what happened. Nonetheless, all those children lived. And the fact is that most of them would not have lived if she had not rescued them. And so I think it's really important for us all to realize that that striving for perfection can be paralyzing, and that you just need to do the best you can with awareness of the possible impacts of what you're doing. And I guess that's why.
Thank you, Alex.
And I would just, as far as the Paris House goes, the people in my book aren't nearly as well intentioned as the characters in Meg's book. And Guillaume, for example, does send another character off on a mission, for want of a better word, with nothing but malice actually in his mind. And as a result of that, the ending that happens at the climax of the book, and it's a rather cataclysmic one, and that's as a result of Guillaume's petty-minded need for revenge. So I don't know, it says something about me or you that that my characters, they don't actually act always with the best of anyone's interest or the best of intentions.
I have Eichmann, so yeah.
You win. He wins that particular one. But and this question about unintended consequences is an interesting one. It's like, that's life. Life is messy. Things don't work out the way that they're supposed to. And I think that the tension that that creates as a writer that's what we feed on. The books would be very boring if everything went according to plan. And I think that the drama that plans gone awry can create that's what makes people turn the pages.
Yes,
absolutely. Alex, can I ask you to talk a little bit more about Suren? He's a really interesting character. Can you tell us about his journey and why you decided to include him in this novel?
Sure. So I was casting around for, as I said, I wanted to have this cast of characters, for want of a better word, more ordinary characters, and the reason why Soren is included goes back 25 years to when I was living in London, And I wasn't like Meg. I'm a sort of recovering attorney, and I was working, and my trainee at the time was a guy who I'm still friends with, and his name was Rafi Varugian, which is about as Armenian a name as you can have. And Rafi and I became good friends, and we both suffered from the same debilitating disease, which is an unending affection for Arsenal Football Club. And we would go every Saturday or every other Saturday and watch our team and suffer collectively as they lost game after game. And we would, either before or after the game, would go and have a pint of beer. And when we would do this, he would tell me about the Armenian genocide that took place in 1915, and about his ancestors who went through it and who survived, and who moved to England. And I always say that novelists are a little bit like magpies. We're always on the lookout for bright, shiny objects. And you see them and you sort of pocket them and you think, oh, I'm going to use that one day, whether it's an idea or a line or a character or whatever it is. And I always thought, well, that's a really interesting story that I know absolutely nothing about. And just, Meg, as you were talking about shining a light on truth, I sort of, we have this wonderful privilege as novelists of being able to shine a little light on things that we think we'd like to lift up and raise up so more people can be aware of them. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write about the Armenian genocide. And since the book has been published, I've had lots of feedback from people going, I had no idea about this. I never, ever knew anything about it. I've also had lots of feedback from a lot of Armenians and people of Armenian descent who are thrilled that this book is talking about this, because it's something that doesn't get talked about. And there is an ongoing, as you're probably aware, an ongoing campaign to have the atrocities committed back then actually classified as a genocide. And that is an ongoing campaign. So I just wanted to, I thought it was an incredibly compelling story. It was one that wasn't well known. But this was like, as I said, 20, 25 years ago, and I've been carrying it around with me in my pocket ever since. And it was only when I got to the point of going, well, I'm going to tell these other stories, but I'm in Paris in 1927. And finally I thought, I can finally use that little bauble that I found, that shiny object, and now I can write about the Armenian genocide. So, playing the long game, if nothing else, and you keep these things. And so that was really it. And I wanted to write about, the other three characters are all French, and they weren't all born in Paris. In fact, none of them were born in Paris, but they all came to Paris. But I wanted to provide another perspective, and having Soren arrive, and he goes through this circuitous route to get to France. He's basically looking for cheese, and he finally finds himself in Paris. And that was a journey that, as I've lived in the States now for 17 years, and I am an immigrant, and so it's I find myself writing about that a lot. And so it was that combination of things, and of course, I mean, and not to give anything away, but Soren suffers tremendous trauma during the genocide, and he sees things that nobody should ever have to see, and he is still 12 years later living with that. And it goes back to the earlier conversation about writing about war. There are some things that will never ever leave you, and that was again something that I wanted to examine.
Yeah, Soren is such a moving character. And I will say I dated an Arsenal fan, so I feel like I have sort of secondary trauma from that quite a while.
Not business.
Yeah. So Meg, you also have some really fascinating secondary characters. And one of the things I loved about Last Train to London is how Truce in some ways feels unattainable. Like I could never be as good as her, but maybe I could be as good as some of the people who helped her. So can you tell us about Helen Bentwich, where she came from, and just tell us more about her?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to say, just to follow up on what Alex said before I dive into this, that one of my roommates in college is Armenian, and so I had heard about the Armenian genocide from her, but I hadn't known anything about it before then. And it is such a one of those moments that deserves to be better known in the world. So I really appreciate that Alex is doing that. So Helen Bentwich is actually based on a real character. I mean, she's a real character. She was, she was somebody who honestly was at one point in time, kind of as I was imagining the story, probably going to have a bigger role. And then one of the things I determined was that there was just so much story here that I had to choose the story, as Alex says, the story I wanted to tell, and set aside as much as I could of everything else, because otherwise I would have War and Peace. And I'm not Tolstoy. So Helen is actually a real British woman. She's Jewish, and she is one of the people who, after Kristallnacht, which is, if you don't know, this night of horrific violence against Jews throughout the German Reich, she and her husband, Norman, decided that they needed to do something. And so they came up with a group of people. They came up with this idea that they could bring Jewish children into safety in England. And there are a lot of reasons why they chose children and not whole families. But that is what they decided. And she's the person who was in many ways the driving force of that. She actually drafted the plan for the Kindertransport, this plan to make this all happen. And her husband is actually the person who went to the Netherlands and approached Truus, who was by then known as somebody who was rescuing children from the Reich, and approached her about approaching Eichmann to get these children out of Vienna, out of Austria. And so that's where she came from. She is somebody who is fortunately, there's enough material about her to know how to write her. A lot of it's material written by her husband, who has written a couple of books. And one of the things you get from his writings is that she's a really extraordinary person. So she was very fun to write. I know way more about her than comes through in the book. I got to do things like, we spent a week in at an apartment in Bloomsbury, trying to sort out exactly where her office was and exactly which building it was, and that kind of thing. The kind of things that novelists do just because, you can. I think novels are very often the tip of an iceberg. What the reader sees is the tip of an iceberg, and there's a whole bunch of ice underneath that the writer has had to gather in order to write the story. But so there's a whole lot of Helen Bentwich that's under the surface. I sometimes think about what, other stories that I might write. And I feel like in The Last Train, I feel like that is a space that I could keep tapping probably for the rest of my life and never tell all the stories that deserve to be told out of it. But Helen it was interesting. She just, sometimes smaller characters just arrive full blown on the page, and partly because it was research, she arrives full blown on the page to me. I mean, she arrived full in, who knows, on the page, but in my mind, she was just there alive. The same thing with one of my main characters is a boy named Stefan. He's a teenage boy. He and Sophie Len kind of represent the children who are rescued. But Stefan has a younger brother whose name is Walter. And Walter just kind of came into the story, dragging this Peter Rabbit behind him, who he speaks through when he can't articulate how he feels. He has Peter speak for him, and that's the way Walter arrived to me. And he's a small character in the book, but he's one of my favorite characters in the book. He just kind of came and stole my heart. So.
It's wonderful when that happens, though. Characters just arrive and you don't know quite where they came from, and it's like, well, come on in. So.
And it is often those who steal both the writers and the readers' hearts. I think I felt the same way about Walter, like, oh, you baby, little Peter Rabbit. Just
You know,
wanted to
I'll
hug
tell you
him.
just a real quick story. When we were doing this cover went through many iterations. This particular part of it, the kid, before it became that cover, and it was a bunch of kids, and it was, you know, it was some pretty hideous covers, and then they sent us this one with exactly this. It's the U.S. cover. There's a different international cover, but. And I showed it to my mother, who had not liked any of the other covers, and she said, "That's perfect. Could you please give him his Peter Rabbit?" You know, she said Walter is her favorite character in the whole book, and she's just felt that was Walter, and I sort of feel the same way. So yeah.
I assumed it was Walter too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we turn it over to the audience. And I think you all have both sort of indicated that you feel the same way. I hope that's correct, for the argument I'm about to make, which is that historical fiction is very much a contemporary author writing about, in some ways, contemporary issues, but channeling it through the past and kind of reaching back to the past to talk about things that we're grappling with today. So what do these stories about the past that you've written have to say to readers today? And we'll start with Meg.
You start with Alec for that one. Yeah, so absolutely. The Last Train to London is certainly a call to arms for people living in the world that we are living in today. It is, by example, many things. I mean, one of the parts of the story is that the people in Vienna, as Hitler was getting ready to march in, could not imagine that Hitler would actually ever march in. I think we don't see the worst things coming until they are not just on our doorstep, but often through our door and raiding our homes. And I feel like that's going on in many ways throughout the world. We see, you know, at this moment in time, this rise of the right, of anti-Semitism, of white supremacy all over the world. And this book is certainly about that and how that has not ended well in the past, and a call to say, look, they didn't see it coming before. You don't see it coming now, but please pay attention here, folks. And then it's also a consideration, an asking of people to please consider what happens when we close borders to people who need our help, which is happening again. You know, I will tell you that that I was writing the book before the 2016 election in the United States. I don't want to get too political here, but I will tell you that with all the things that have happened around the world at the time, I wrote it as fast as I have ever written anything. I'd been researching it for over a decade by then, but I wrote it very quickly. It sold very quickly. It sold at auction. Part of the reason I went with HarperCollins is because they felt the need to publish this book at this time, right now, because this is happening again, and we all need to be reminded that this does not end well. So yeah, this is absolutely, every once in a while I get somebody who loves the book and takes issue with my politics, and I sometimes wonder if they have actually read the same book that I wrote. So yeah, it's important.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of heartache in reading it. Alex, what about you?
Well, it's almost impossible to follow what Meg said, because everything that she said is so true, and her book so brilliantly pulls back the curtain on, and it's a wonderful. She put it better than I ever could. What she said, it's so good and so prescient in so many ways, and that's that old line about people who don't read history are doomed to repeat it. I mean, it's so true. I wish I had anything as material as that to offer you by way of substance. I don't think I do, really. I mean, I think that my book, the characters in the book, we talked about war and about the effects of war, and we talked a little bit just in the previous answer about immigration and those sorts of things. But I guess that if I were to talk about the applicability of what happened then and now, it would actually be less to do with the sort of anything political really, and it's more just the sort of I hope a universality of what my characters feel and what they go through is, I hope, something that everybody is going to recognize. And we haven't talked about Marcel Proust, but the usual translation of who's a character in the book, and the usual translation of his masterwork in English is In Search of Lost Time, and which could have really been taken as a subtitle to the Paris Hours, because all four of the main characters all of them are looking back, they're looking behind and searching or yearning for something that they have lost. And I think that is an emotion that, to a greater or lesser degree and in myriad different ways, is something that most people at some point will feel and will be able to sort of recognize and register and sort of go, oh, yeah. So, you know, my book is a very different kind of a book to Meg's book, and it operates on a very different scale and a different register. So that would be, I think my answer is that the emotions that they go through, they're very powerful and hopefully true and believable. And those things carry on. They, nothing ever changes in some ways. The stories that we have to tell, they vary in the detail, but the eternal emotional truths of living a human existence don't vary that much.
Yeah, that's right. I would add that I think your novel is also looking a little bit at questions about female ambition and about art and its place in the world. And there really are a lot of eternal themes in both of your works that I think contemporary readers will find resonating in their lives. So now let's check in with Phil and see what our lovely audience is thinking.
Absolutely. Meg, Alex, thank you so much for your insights. That was wonderful. And Carrie, thank you for your moderation. We do have a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to dive right into them. First one comes from Megan, and this is for both of you, or it could go for all of you, actually. Does your writing process change at all between each of your books that you've worked on?
I'll go first on that one, just for whatever. I will say that I have, for this book, The Last Train to London, I wrote it very differently than any book I have ever written. So the answer is clearly yes. And what I did for this one, but I will say that I've changed how I'm writing going forward. What I did for this one is I wrote it first as a screenplay. I was daunted by the story. It's a big story. I'm not Jewish. It's a very important story in the Jewish culture, and it made me nervous to take it on. As a little Catholic girl from the Midwest of the United States, this, story set in Europe, big figures, and so important to the Jewish culture. But so what I did was I wrote it as a screenplay for a lot of reasons, but the biggest reason was that I knew that it would be really hard for me to think about how I was going to write a screenplay. And so I'd be spending a lot of time thinking about the structure of a screenplay and the particular requirements of a screenplay, which would free me in the back of my brain to develop the stories. Like one of the things I usually do is I walk or run a lot, and a lot of my story ideas come while I'm doing some exercise. So this is like the functional equivalent of walking or running while I was writing. What it really did was it made me a screenplay is a very limited number of words. It's a very limited number of pages. You have to make your choices very carefully, and every scene has to count. And so what that did was it made me focus on the story and getting the structure of the story first before I started putting too many, of those pretty shiny things that Alex and I like to talk about, sprinkling them around in the story. And as a result, I truly feel like it's the best story I've ever written. And my editor, this is the first time I worked with her, but she's read my prior work. She said, not that your other writing isn't great, but this is just on a whole nother level, and what'd you do different? And that's what I did. I wrote it as a screenplay. I thought about story structure first. And that has the benefit of I didn't write, 100 pages on some lovely little moment that I liked, only to have them torn out of the book because they didn't move the plot along. So that's the way I'll be writing in the future. It's not the way I've written in the past. I've always outlined, but not to this extent. And that was very helpful for me. Alex?
And for me, it was very different as well, because of the way that the book is structured and having these alternating chapters. There is absolutely no resemblance between the order in which the words on the page appear now and the order in which they were written, because my brain isn't nearly big enough to do that. So the way that I had to do it was to write one character at a time and several chapters at a time. So 5 or 6 chapters, and then I would have a break, and I would do another chapter and go back and then do that. And then I mean, quite literally shuffled them together into the chapters and then see whether or not it worked. And then there was an awful lot of editing that went on at the end. And, you know, doing it in the way that I did and having it over the course of one day was, I mean, it was a challenge, to put it mildly. And there was a lot of banging my head against a wall at various points, because I would suddenly realize that on page 192, there was a glitch in the space-time continuum, and we suddenly went back a little bit, and then we had to get forward. So it was a monstrous thing to edit, because one tiny change in one of the 4 narratives had ripple effects throughout the whole thing, and I get into a cold sweat just thinking about it. So that was very different. And you know, in the past, my books have taken a very well, much more sort of traditional, conventional narrative form, and like, you start here and then you go there. Like, it's nice.
Excellent. Carrie, did you want to add anything? Okay, great. All right, moving on here. Let's see, this next one here comes from Christine. All right, this is actually a comment. So, Alex, I was a bit confused at first until I became familiar with the characters and fell in love with each. I was quite surprised with the lovely twist as the last chapter came together. Very well done. So, nice job. All right, this next question, actually, I'm glad I made it to number 3 on the list. This is from me. A question for you, Meg. I assume that more often than not, many of the children who were brought to foster homes and schools in England were the only Holocaust survivors from their families. Were you able to research the outcome of any of these children, or were you able to communicate firsthand with any of their relatives? And if not, was this something you considered?
Yeah, I'll tell you, the place the story started was my son. I'd never heard of Kindertransport until one day my 15-year-old son, who was a very voluble kid, used to ride his bike down the street singing. So everybody knew when he was coming home. Came home one day, just not saying a word. And I thought a girl had broken his heart or something. And so I finally said, hey, Nick, you know, is everything okay? And he said, yeah, he was just digesting this interview he'd just done. And it turned out he'd interviewed somebody who'd survived the Kindertransport. He went on to interview 4 of those 4 survivors. And it turns out that there are many oral histories and videos, and there's quite a database of histories of the real survivors. So as I was writing the novel, you know, one of the things I always feel is this, you know, you never know a novel's going to be a novel, can be anything until somebody buys it, right? And one of the things I know is that the people who told these stories, it's often they didn't tell even their family members. It was very painful for them to talk about. And I didn't want to burden anybody by making them tell me their story for something that might never be anything. So I virtually met a lot of people just by reading their, you know, probably 100 or more interviews of people who had survived. But I hadn't actually met any of them until the book was purchased. And then after the book was purchased, I started the real Kinder started coming to me in all sorts of ways. They came to readings. They read the books. Somebody sent them a copy of the book. It was extraordinary. The first real people I met the summer before the book was published. I was invited to come to Amsterdam and meet some of them and speak to them. They were traveling on the 80th anniversary of the trains. And it was just this totally magical moment, meeting these people that I've been writing about in person. And then since the book has been out, I've been connected with so many people. It's just been one of the incredible joys of writing this book, is the people I've met along the way. You know, somebody who they're all obviously all older now, right? I've met a lot of the second generation and even third generation, but somebody who was, her name is Marianne Wolf. She's a writer too. She was number 211 on that first train of truces that I write about. And she wrote me that and introduced herself that way. She said she was number 211. And she just had one question, which was, she was surprised the book was fiction because it so paralleled her own experience on the train. And I got the most extraordinary email from, I met a guy in San Diego who was like Walter, all grown up. He was just like, we talked for like 2 hours after the end of an event of mine that he came to. It was so lovely to meet him. And I just thought, he's just like Walter, all grown up. And then I got this, an email from a man I've now connected with, who is in Israel. The book's not out, it's coming in Israel, but it isn't out in Israel yet. But somebody had sent him the book from the United States who knew him. And he emailed me to say that he just finished reading it, and he was actually put on a train when he was 18 months old. And he said he had been struggling for a long time to understand his own experience. And he'd read everything there was on the Kindertransport. And he said nothing had made him feel like he understood his own experience as much as my book. And it was just like I can hardly talk about his email without, bawling. But that has been the most unexpected and most amazing part of this journey, is connecting with the real people. And I'll just say one thing and then I'll turn this over to somebody else. But one of the people I met in person was one of those first 4 women that my son interviewed. And we now correspond practically daily. We were supposed to do an event together in North Carolina where she lives, but that was canceled due to coronavirus. But now I'm going next spring instead, and we're going to put the event on next spring instead. And it's just been amazing. So one of the things on my website is that it's in process, it's not quite done yet, but is pictures of some of the real Kinder who I've met along the way and a little bit about their stories. And that's been cool. That's been amazing.
That's great. That is a great thing to do. Wow, I can't even imagine like having someone contact you with a story like that,
Oh, yeah, right.
Well, the next one we've got here, this is from Jenny, and this is for Carrie. She says, I'm halfway through Salt the Snow. Was Millie based on a real reporter from the time? If so, how much of her experience in Russia is based on factual events?
That's very nice of you. Thank you, Jenny. I usually don't like being in the spotlight when I'm moderating. I really want the attention to be on the guest authors. So but I will answer that quickly. Yes, Millie was a real newspaper woman who went to Moscow in the 1930s. And the story is very closely based on her experience as detailed in her letters back to her friends. And Meg said that she tends to hew very closely towards the purist side of the spectrum on historical fiction. And it's funny, as a reader, I couldn't care less. And yet as a writer, I feel like, I really have to put in everything that I know is true. And it feels like it would be a travesty if I purposefully strayed from the historical record when I didn't have to. So it's pretty true to life as much as I could make it. Thank you.
Carrie, that as a reader, you might be like that, but there are so many people who are not like that. And the tiniest little mistake that you make will have them hurling the book across the room. And once they hold the book across the room, they will then write to you and tell you what you got wrong. So you do need to, so bless you for being a generous reader.
I'm going to say also that, I think it does, if you know history and somebody's writing about it and they haven't said, okay, this is an alternate history or whatever, history and you're reading about something and somebody does, something that not to be true, to be anti-true, the opposite of true. It can take you out of the story. And so for readers like that, you want to be you want to keep people in the story. You don't want to undermine people's confidence in your story.
Yeah.
So that's why
there's a difference between a mistake, a historical error, and a purposeful use of history as a narrative element in a way that changes history in order to serve the story.
Right.
And so I'm very tolerant of the latter. Nobody wants to see the former.
Yeah.
And hopefully none of us have made those mistakes.
And yet, and yet I'm going to say, as a historical fiction writer, those are sometimes the hardest things, because you're writing something, and it's the things that you don't think about that can be so hard. Like you think, oh, for the Wednesday Sisters, I had a scene on a freeway, and it's set in the 1960s, right? On a freeway in the Bay Area. It's set in Palo Alto, and it occurred to me when the book was in copy edits that freeway might not have been there at the time. So I took it out and made it just a generic freeway. And it turned out, somebody said to me along the way, "Oh, I'm so glad, I'm so glad you had that scene set on 101, because 280 wasn't there at the time." I'm like, yeah, that was on 280 until I changed it at the last minute. So it's those things that you don't think to think about that are something you get wrong.
Yeah, I think this is what historical fiction writers cry into their beer cups about when we're sitting together, after hours at the happy hour, like the things that keep you up at night. How did they light a lantern in the 17th century? I don't know.
Exactly. Did they have lanterns? What did they look like? Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Alex, do you find it easier to write historical fiction about characters who were real people, or characters you completely make up? And is being a writer better than being a lawyer?
Well, I can answer. Can I answer the second one first?
Yes, you can.
Yes, it is. Yeah, Meg agrees. Yeah, we both worked in very large corporate law firms, and so yeah, it's telling stories is much more fun. And as to the first question, I mean, is it easier? Was that the question? Is it easier to write?
Did you find it easier to write historical fiction about characters who were real people, or characters you completely make up?
I mean, I always enjoy telling the story, making the characters up, because you have more license to tell the story that you want to tell. And one of the things about, I was talking before about the level of comfort that we all have and the spectrum, and I think all three of us are probably on different places on that spectrum. It sounds to me like I'm further away than the other two. So one of the characters in my book, one of the main four characters, was the maid of Marcel Proust, and it's based, the story of Camille, her name is Camille, and she's based very largely on Proust's actual maid, Celeste Alberet. And in fact, in early drafts, the character was called Celeste, and I actually used her actual name. And I was fully intending to do that and to explain that this is a real person, but I'm sort of taking liberties. But those liberties, as the book went on, got greater and greater. To the point where even my comfort threshold was actually breached, so that I no longer felt comfortable with representing that this was Celeste's life, because I talk about the gaps that we jump into, and we do that work in that place where we don't know what happened. Well, by that point, the story had developed to such a point where I knew that hadn't happened. So at that point, rather late on in the day, far too late for my editor's taste, but oh well, I actually said, well, I need to change the name, because I no longer feel comfortable calling this person Celeste and giving her the name of the actual person. And so that's an illustrative, I guess, of where I was. And so it's it's all to like, but I mean, I enjoyed both. I enjoy creating characters out of whole cloth, but it was also fun to develop the character of Camille through a pre-existing sort of person who was there. And the interesting thing about Celeste is that Proust was revered more than you can imagine in France. I mean, they love their writers. Maybe the Irish like their writers more, but there aren't many other countries who do. And Proust in particular. And when he died, for the next 50 years, she was harried and pestered to tell her story, and she never, ever did. She was incredibly discreet, and she wouldn't talk to anybody. And then just towards the end of her life, she wrote a memoir about her time with Proust, which I borrowed in very, very heavily to tell this story. And so I had her voice in my head, and that was tremendously helpful to have that sort of first-hand account. So I think that was wonderfully helpful. I think it was harder to write the characters when you were just relying on sort of third-party accounts, whether it's a biography or whether it's some other kind of history. Obviously, people like Hemingway wrote things like A Movable Feast, which is, again, very helpful because that's actually in his words. So both doing both offer different. They present different challenges and offer different rewards, and it was fun to do both for sure. I'm not sure which I prefer. Probably making it up myself because I don't need to worry so much. But it was fun to do both.
Meg, what do you think about that?
I'm with Alex. I like doing both. There's a great beauty to having something to start with and real facts. And there's certainly somebody like Hemingway. My last novel is called Beautiful Exiles. It's Hemingway and Gellhorn, and that was fun. I mean, because they're real people, and you kind of didn't have to make it up. And that is true, like of somebody like Truce, where she's just so extraordinary. You don't have to make it up. But there is, we're fiction writers, and we're not biographers, and so like in The Last Train to London, Truce is real, but Sophie and Stefan, even though they are based on real stories, real children who, the stories of real children who went through this, they are themselves not real children, nor is Walter. So I could make up whatever I wanted about them. I could give them a nice little love story and all that kind of thing, and that's fun. It's creative. So I like both. I love mixing it up. Yeah.
Can I add one other thing? There's a nice line which I really like that the novelist E.L. Doctorow wrote, and just you talked about we're novelists, we make stuff up, and he said that historians will tell you what happened, and novelists will tell you what it felt like.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, that's the point of historical fiction, is it allows the reader to step into somebody else's shoes and really experience it. And, the way a novelist tells a story is just a different way than a historian tells a story, because we are getting down onto the street level. We are looking at, as Carrie said, what kind of lamps they're lighting and how they're lighting it. And hopefully in a way that makes you imagine yourself in that world. It's Otto Frank, said I'm going to paraphrase it because I'm terrible at getting direct quotes, but it's more important to learn lessons from history than to learn history lessons. And I think that's what a historical novel does, is it allows you to learn a lesson from history. It's like Carrie was talking about earlier, you're taking what happened in the past and bringing it into the present in a way that helps people understand the present and hopefully negotiate the present in a better way than they would have if they weren't readers.
Meg, Alex, Carrie, I can't thank you guys enough for being here with us today. This was fantastic. It's just great.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been fun.
Really a pleasure. And for me, it's always a pleasure just to listen to Alex's accent. Thanks so much.
I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Parents and everyone, we encourage you to support our partner, independent bookstore, Politics and Prose, where you can easily order your copies of tonight's books right now by clicking on the link that we have in our description box below. Just click on that link and pick up all the books from tonight's authors. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m., join us for a conversation with E.J. Dionne and his book, Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Then, on Sunday, we wrap up this year's book festival with 2 events. It's already done. I can't believe it. It just started, but it's coming to an end. This Sunday, we have a great program, though. In the morning, we have the little guys can come, little guys and girls can join us for story time and drawing lessons with best-selling author Juana Medina as she shares her latest book, Juana and Lucas, Big Problemas. Then, at 3 p.m., we have a special presentation just for parents. Join us for a discussion about the new book, How to Raise a Reader, co-authored by Maria Russo, the children's books editor of the New York Times Book Review. How to Raise a Reader is an indispensable guide to welcoming children from babies to teens to a lifelong love of reading. In the meantime, take a look around our YouTube channel for lots of engaging content for kids and some really great upcoming adult programming. I am your VGBF host, Phil Kaminsky. Have a great Friday evening. We will see you tomorrow night. And as always, please